I don't know really what one can say to a range of people who are involved in the political, social, economic, legal, as well as business reconstruction or construction of a country and a state, particularly coming from the outside. And it raises an important question for scholars and policymakers who've been involved in state building, peace building, and all of these practices and activities that go along with it, from rule of law programming to SSR, DDR type military and security service reform, through to economic infrastructural reconstruction, democratization, human rights programming, and so on and so forth, which is that it carries an expertise. It comes from an expertise which is inevitably going to be external, and inevitably it will be driven by the hegemons of the contemporary international system. And one of the important questions that is raised here is what kind of peace and conflict, development, reconstruction, political, social, and economic expertise comes from within the society that is reinventing itself in the modern world, given that many of the frameworks of the modern state are designed externally. So really that's what I can offer, is this overview of how state building and peace building practices and policies have emerged in the last 25 years. What this means in a broader context, because experimenting over the nature of the state, the role of the state, what it can do and what it shouldn't do, is a story, a narrative in human history that goes back to Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, with their different understandings of the social contract, of citizenship, of leadership, and legitimate political authority. And in many ways, we're rehashing the same debates that they were having. You know, what should the citizen do? Who is a citizen? What is the leader allowed to do? How far does the leader have to act with social consent, or according to best practice, or according to specific expertise that this benevolent or autocratic leader may have in the formation of the state? What I want to do then in this short discussion today is talk about various experiences of state building and peace building, but also to compare it to local grassroots action, activism and mobilization that's also arisen in the context of this last 25 years of the attempt to build what we call the liberal peace, the liberal democratic state around the world. If you think about the broader sweep of modern history, after the Cold War you had still a whole range of post-colonial states that were unstable, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. You had parts of Southeast Asia, and then of course you had the post-socialist world coming out of the Cold War framework that were looking for stability. And the question, which was very quickly answered in the early 1990s, was what type of state would these new policies form? And the answer was going to be, according to the UN, Boutros Ghali's famous document Agenda for Peace, was going to be a liberal democratic state. But most importantly, that state would be built on foreign intervention. And here you are in Kosovo, you know all about that story, that narrative, the pros and the cons of that story. So the question for us is, what type of state is emerging? What type of state guarantees rights and prosperity and progress, both through local agency, local activism, and through international standard setting? Again, here in Kosovo, you know all about standards too, international norms for state building and so on. So this paper will take us through, I hope, a few examples. I'm not going to talk about Kosovo, although I have done research on Kosovo, but I would never consider myself to be an expert. I'm just interested in Kosovo. And I have a fairly long-standing interest in Kosovo, but that interest is not quite as long-standing as my interest in Cyprus, for example, where I lived for 10 years, and I've been researching it for more than 20 years. When I go to Cyprus today, I'm fairly well known there for being interested in Cyprus, but they would never call me an expert, right? So you're the experts, and I defer to your authority on that. But I'm going to talk about some other cases in this talk, which are, I think, quite telling, informative about the broader patterns of state building, but most importantly, what we expect as citizens of the modern state in a globally governed world today. Okay. I don't know whether it's the done thing to interrupt here and ask questions, but if any of you have a burning point you want to make, you really should feel free to intervene.
Yes.
Otherwise, I will just go on and on. If we think about the way in which the modern peace agreement emerged in the 1990s, now historically, a peace agreement was something which happened at the elite level. Political elites and military leaders would be brought together and they would negotiate an agreement. The agreement would become a legal document. Eventually it might become a constitutional framework for a state. But that agreement, that document, would be a way in which the security and political and material interests of political and military leaders would be balanced. And in the theoretical literature that emerged in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, a peace agreement was really about forming a balance of power between those factions in a conflict-affected area, either between two states or in a society. And I guess if you think about the Camp David Accords in the late 1970s, where President Carter, the US president, brought the leaders of Egypt and Israel, these were political elites. They represented entrenched power structures in both countries. They were taken to the United States, to Camp David, and they were basically locked up for 13 days in September and expected to come to an agreement. And this agreement would balance territory, it would balance power, and it would balance political objectives. And that sort of pattern of a peace agreement, it goes all the way back to the 18th and 19th century. Henry Kissinger famously wrote about it in his PhD thesis as a kind of a technique in which maybe an external mediator with some status, with some standing, with some power, would try to get national political leaders to make an agreement with each other. This agreement would have some impact on the nature of the state and its constitution. It would have to be built into the state. Now, by the 1990s, we see this at Dayton, at the Dayton Peace Agreement in 1995. But that approach is starting to look a bit outdated, because those sorts of peace agreements, and the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel in the 1970s, weren't focused on issues like human rights, or standards for governance, or meeting the law. They were really about balancing interests. So historical injustice, social agency, human rights, these sorts of things didn't tend to be built into that style of peace agreement. So, famously the Dayton Agreement had a constitutional framework, but it was in an annex. It wasn't in the agreement itself. It was marginal to the actual overall agreement, although today, of course, it's become the crucial part of the lived experience of the Dayton Peace Agreement. So by the 1990s, we're in a situation where a peace agreement was deemed to be inadequate by the international community, led by the Americans, the Europeans, within the UN system. You had to have more than that. You had to have an agreement which shaped what was called a good state. Now, a good state in an Aristotelian sense would be a state in which there was a social contract, in which the population was satisfied with the agreement, not just the leaders. It wasn't just about a balance of power. It was actually about creating a world, a globally governed world, of states that followed similar standards of human rights, of democracy, but also of public services, access to healthcare and education, infrastructure, access to global markets, and so on. And this became known as the liberal peace architecture. So the response in the 1990s, and this is when Kosovo enters the picture, the response in the 1990s to the question, what is a peace agreement, how will it be developed, and so on, would be, well, a peace agreement would be to create a state which looks like Germany or Denmark or Sweden or Norway or maybe Britain to some degree. So you can see that there's an example here, there's an exemplar of the good state created by a peace agreement. And it has all of these ramifications, the relationship between the citizen and the leadership, close representation of the population through democracy, standards for rights through the legal framework of the state and the constitutional framework of the state, which has implications for minorities and so on, and so forth. The ways in which taxation is raised and spent, on what is it spent, on education, health service, the media, transparency, accountability, and all of these systems, and so forth. So increasingly the peace agreement turns into a system, a comprehensive approach to building an overall framework which regulates relations within the state, between power structures and populations, but also across the region. So we had an increasing regionalization of the understanding of peace in the 1990s. The European Union, of course, is the historical exemplar of the regional level, but also the African Union and other regional organizations now developing. And this process, this development of the peace agreement into this more comprehensive, multi-level, multilateral, multidimensional framework, which captures all of our lives and the systems that we live under, political, economic, and social, was rapidly seen to be a defining moment in the development of the state, of political theory, of policy practices, economic, social, and political. Which is why the Agenda for Peace document of 1992, and then later documents, Agenda for Democratization, Agenda for Development, later on Responsibility to Protect, all of these documents are supposed to establish a kind of watertight peace system, a watertight international, liberal international architecture. It's supposed to be secure, stable, spreading the benefits of a peace dividend, sustainable in the long term, and in many ways emancipatory. So it emancipates us from oppressive power structures, oppressive social practices, whether political, economic, cultural, religious, even linguistic, and gives us a whole new sphere of political, social, economic, and cultural freedoms in which to operate. So you can see how this is supposed to be, and is seen by many as a really big step forward in human political history. And being able to build a state like that, state building or peace building, is seen by many, particularly theorists in the global north, as something which we have to protect, which we have to valorize. This is one of the biggest steps forward in thinking about peace, security, and the state in 2,000 years. Now, of course, the reality has been rather different. The actual practice. This raises the question: how does it look in reality? And how do people take this? How do the populations in different locations around the world, in Timor-Leste, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Northern Ireland, in Guatemala, Liberia, Sierra Leone, how do they respond to this type of practice, this type of state building? Is it good enough? Is it a good state? Are there gaps? Are there things that are missing? In other words, is this state that is being built through this external expertise and technology meeting the expectations of the populations of those states? If it is, great. If it isn't, what are the actual expectations of those populations? How do we bridge the gap between the expectations and demands and claims that are being made by populations in conflict-affected societies with the actual state and the international architecture that's being developed? Okay, so in practice, could you just go back to the previous There's just one sentence I want to point to there. Yeah, so in practice, what seems to have emerged from many international interventions is a city-state rather than a state. So if you look at somewhere like Timor-Leste, for example, Dili, the capital of Timor-Leste, is very much like a kind of a liberal city that you might find in Northern Europe. Okay? So the focus of expertise and material resources, law making, political institution building, and so on and so forth, has had quite a big impact on the capital city, but not a great deal of impact on the area outside the capital city. And in fact, if you talk to people in Timor, in general, they would say that the peace that has emerged is not really a positive peace. It's not really emancipatory. I mean, sure, there's physical security. That's much better than it was pre-war and in the early post-war period in Timor-Leste. But in practice, the deeper positive freedoms, the positive rights, the positive peace hasn't really been achieved. And I think that's a pattern which we see. Can we go to the next overhead? The pattern which we see in general across many conflict-affected societies that have been subjected to post-conflict peace building and state building in the last 25 years. So, in general, we see the emergence of security. So, basic physical security, we've done, I think, rather well at, although many people living in conflict-affected societies might say that doesn't go far enough. But for the internationals who are planning in DPKO or in the security institutions from NATO to the US would say, actually, we've seen a stabilization of regional order and quite often domestic order in most of the countries where we've seen this kind of intervention. So they would give that a tick. Whether you would is another matter, because you might be thinking more in terms of human security rather than regional or state security. Where things get rather more difficult is in the question, or rather vis-a-vis the question of the type of state that has emerged in terms of its social contract, its economic development, its representation of the different claims and groups in society. As we move into debates about a positive peace as opposed to a negative peace. So a negative peace is all about basic security. You know, do you think you'll be alive tomorrow and next month and next year? That's negative peace stuff. Positive peace is more about questions relating to the distribution of power, resources, rights across the state in the medium to longer term. Is it fair? Is it equitable? Is it just? Have the deeper underlying questions of justice been dealt with? Have the root causes of war and conflict been dealt with? And here we see a rather more difficult picture, and one which really points to the limitations of international intervention as the main medium through which a state may be built, through which a regional order may be reconstructed. In fact, what we tend to see is the creation of a type of state which doesn't look very much like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, or even the UK. So even though those types of states have been the model, there have been, in practice, many, many shortcomings. And I can point to a few obvious ones. Britain was closely involved with the reconstruction of Sierra Leone after its wars in the 1990s. The state that was built was supposed to be a state which was democratic, human rights observing, and rapidly developing to meet the needs of the population. However, in the recent crises over Ebola, this awful disease which swept across West Africa last year and this year, we saw that the state that had been produced, the state that had been created by all of this international intervention, military intervention, and then foreign donor resources to try to build a viable set of institutions, to create a rule of law, and so on and so forth, could not deal with this disease. Now, you might say that this disease was a crisis. It was a much higher level of let's say, obstacles to the smooth running of the state than one might expect in everyday life. But on the other hand, it's not the first time that there's been this type of crisis. And one would expect the state that you live in to be able to deal with crises. That's the point of the state. The point of the state is to produce order, peace, security, and prosperity, both in the short term, but also in the long term. The state is supposed to be eternal. So we saw that the amount of trained doctors and hospital beds in Sierra Leone, and also neighbouring Liberia, were woefully inadequate compared to the needs that were caused by this crisis. So it suggests that the type of state that's being produced by foreign intervention and peace building and all of these programs, all of this technical expertise to build the state from outside, is actually rather limited. And you might say, going back to a 19th century concept, the type of state that was being built in Sierra Leone was a kind of night watchman state. It was very limited in its capacity. The state was not supposed to produce broad public services, healthcare and education, and all those sorts of things which were deemed necessary for the good life. Instead, the state was supposed to simply be a regulatory framework in which people would do that for themselves. But of course, in situations of crisis, whether it's a humanitarian disaster or a war or a disease like Ebola, the state has to be much more responsive and have many more capacities than just simply the night watchman state would have. So there's something about the limited nature of the state which is problematic in these intervention and peace building situations. That's one dimension. The material capacity of the state is limited. Another dimension is the way in which this state, which is being built from the outside, connects to the political aspirations of the population. Does it? Does it respond to those aspirations? Because that means that the internationals, the external actors who are building these states, understand those aspirations, which means they can read your newspapers and read your reports and are part of your advocacy movements and so on and so forth. Now, of course, that's not the case. International engagement with local grassroots political movements is not really ever going to happen. Most international engagement is at the high table, at the high level, such as with the Camp David peace agreements of the 1970s between Egypt and Israel, or the Bosnia peace accords, the Dayton peace agreement. So they're concerned about that level of issues. There is a high level of abstraction, therefore, in these sorts of peace agreements, these peace processes, even when it comes to state building. And I think you see the same at the level of the United Nations, at the level of the European Union. These are distant organizations given a relatively difficult, perhaps one might say an impossible task of building very localized states in a shifting regional order. So the outcome of that kind of peace building and state building in the last 25 years has been something quite ragged, I think. It probably looks better from the outside than it does from the inside, once you take away the security issues. If we can go to the next. Here's a little picture which you might recognize. Recognize that? Yeah. I actually used that as a cover for a book that I've recently published.
Oh, very good.
I think it's quite interesting because, of course, the UN came to Kosovo and all the internationals came to Kosovo in order to promote liberal democracy and human rights and justice and to create a regional order which would help stabilize in the post-Yugoslav era. And of course, many people in the UN felt this was unfair. In the international community, they felt it was unfair to be told off for being unfair themselves. But clearly there's something going on here about the state that's being produced by intervention, which the internationals need to listen to. And it doesn't just relate to security issues or regional order, but it relates to expectations and claims that are being made by people on the ground. And these are claims that are being made against the modern state in Kosovo, but also they relate to Kosovo's relative position in the region and the world. Now, internationals, from Timor to Kosovo to Bosnia and so on and so forth, across the conflict-affected world of these 30 to 50 states in which the international community has been involved in trying to build peace and build a state in the last 25 years, would look at a situation like this and say there are standards, there are norms, there is international law, there are expectations, there are blueprints and standards which have to be achieved by the local population, by, in particular, local leaders, if we are to start to address the gap between the positionality of the Kosovo state or the Timorese state and the broader international community. And they would say, it's up to you, it's up to the conflict-affected population to make sure that the standards are met by leaders and by the population through the democratic process which is regulated by the rule of law and the Constitution. So they would say this is unfair to be accused of being unfair, because it's not their responsibility. However, if we go back through the last 100 years of intervention to maintain order in the world, we can see, of course, that it is an international responsibility. And in fact, it's a responsibility that international actors take upon themselves. They assume it quite willingly. We have a whole global architecture, from the UN system, the donor system, the foreign policy apparatus, and not least, the way in which international architecture has been built through international law, through the international institutions, to the nature of the state that is being created around the world. Now, internationals expect international law to be followed. They expect international standards to be met, and they expect the state that's being built to look very much like the type of state that they imagine is peaceful, stable, developing, contributes to regional prosperity and security. So I think this is a fair criticism. A couple of weeks ago I was in New York and I made it to the 38th floor of the UN, that's the top floor, and I saw the red carpet of Ban Ki-moon. I saw it, I didn't walk on it. But I talked to some of the senior advisors who are working in peacekeeping, DPKO, peacekeeping operations and so on. And one of them said to me, is it true that the UN is being seen as a kind of new colonial power out there? And I thought, that's an interesting question, but it's 25 years late. Another said to me, is it the case that the UN should be expected? Is it fair that the UN should be expected to produce justice, security, stability, order in all of these many countries around the world where the UN is engaged, where the international institutions, the World Bank, the donors, whether it's the British or the Americans or the European Union, is it our responsibility? Good question. I think the answer is yes. The next thing that came up, which I think is also quite important, is somebody whose work I really respect asked me whether I felt that the system, the architecture for building a state, for creating peace, for doing development, was the problem, or whether it was political will at the elite level, whether international, regional, or state level. And personally, I think that we actually have a rather good intellectual and policy framework for peace building, state building, development, and producing security and so on. The problem is political will. Nobody actually has the leverage, and if they have the leverage, they're not willing to use it. And one of the worst things about that visit I had to the UN a couple of weeks ago was that they really do feel like the UN system is going the way of the League of Nations. It's moribund. And they take this kind of criticism, not just quite personally, but also indicative of a shifting international order. And they are concerned that the UN system itself may just get left behind by the rise of the BRICS, for example, the new emerging actors on the world stage, the shifting geopolitical dynamics that we currently see, and so on and so forth. So from that perspective, this whole experience of peace building and state building has been rather negative. The international system, the UN, the system of global government has lost legitimacy around the world. Many states don't take it very seriously these days. And also many people in conflict-affected and development settings don't really think that the intentions of international actors are genuine. They're genuinely working on their behalf, for the people, as it were. Instead, they feel that, in general, the system is designed to prevent them from making claims against international actors. In other words, it's to keep you all quiet, to make you shut up, not to be active, not to mobilize, but just to wait in the queue of development, and so on and so forth. So it's a rather oppositional and rather negative situation that we find ourselves in when assessing this 25 years of peace building since the end of the Cold War in all of these different countries around the world. However, if we can go, I think the next one. I don't want to bore you with too much of the data and detail and so on, but can we go to the, okay, so we've talked about unfair. Can we go to the next one? Okay, we've talked about the problem of the state not being adequate. Can we go to the next one? Okay, just stop here for a sec. If we look at the data that we have, which compares the world's peace building and development settings in the early 1990s to today, what we see is very mixed results. So the Human Development Index, which is a UNDP index, which measures a whole range of social indicators and political and economic indicators for every country in the world, is an important index which helps us look at, let's say, the data for Kosovo in 2000 versus the data for Kosovo in 2014. And we can do that with every conflict-affected or development setting country in the world now. So we actually have a lot of data which allows us to show what the post-war situation was like compared to the contemporary situation. In terms of things like GDP, life expectancy, access to healthcare, and other situations like births per capita, and so on and so forth. There's a broad swathe of data which indicates that there actually have been some improvements in most conflict-affected societies. Those improvements suggest that state building and peace building is working. Maybe not quickly, but it is working over the longer term. However, if you compare the data that we have for conflict-affected societies with the data that we have for non-conflict affected societies, because the Human Development Index is for every country in the world, or all 193 UN members, plus a few that aren't yet direct UN members. If we look at that data, comparing the developed economies, the advanced economies with the emerging economies, you would expect that conflict-affected societies would improve much more quickly than advanced economies, because the starting point is much lower for a conflict-affected society. Okay? In actual fact, the advanced economies are doing better than the conflict-affected economies. Some of the developing economies are doing much better than the advanced economies. But it raises the question of, why is the so-called peace dividend not greater than it has been over the last 15, 20 or 25 years for many conflict-affected societies. Because we would expect that it would be very significant. Advanced economies should not be developing as fast. In other words, the peace dividend should be much bigger, given that the donor inflows, the liberation of human capital, the social agency on the ground, and the overall regulatory framework of the state, which is supposed to be empowering for conflict-affected societies. So here's a puzzle. It's an important question which we haven't answered and we can't answer, I think, with the current information that we have. But it's one that we have to address. If intervention is to produce a successful process of peace building and state building, I think we should expect the data, and I can show you the data in a later session if you want to see it, because I have it on an Excel spreadsheet. It's very, very large. And it compares all of these 23 conflict-affected countries and also a few others now. And it does suggest that progress in conflict-affected countries after a peace agreement is slower than in developed and advanced economies. And that's counterintuitive. It should be the reverse. Advanced economies should be settled, and we should have much more potential for development and for improvement across all of the indicators: institution building, public services, and so on and so forth. So the question is it the intervention that's the problem? Is it the type of state that's the issue? Or is it the local social agency that's trying to build the state, the institutions, work within them over time? That's an open question. My hunch is it's the type of state that's the issue. The architecture of the state has been a problem. Which means what's happening on the ground is a big question. If we go back to Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and we run through the whole canon of Western theory to Immanuel Kant, and then to the United Nations Charter, which was supposed to capture this whole history of understanding of politics, of rights of the individual, of the nature of the state, and then of the international architecture. We can see that one of the key underlying themes relates to the question of how people mobilize, what they mobilize for, what they want from their state overall. So I'd like to, if we can go to the next one, have a look at this for a moment. Now, one of the things that we don't know much about in the last 25 years in the policy and the academic literatures is how local social movements, local actors in society, how they position themselves in terms of the transformation of society and the development of the state itself. One of the reasons why we don't know much about it is because internationals aren't very interested in what happens in local societies. They're focused, in fact, they're fixated on the technology of the state, what the state should be like, how it should be, which means the constitution, the security services, the police, the institutions, the parliament, voting patterns, human rights, the rule of law, and all of those sorts of things. And I'm not saying that's not important, because that's absolutely essential. That's the shell of the state. But the question is, what's inside it? How are people acting? If you look at these quotations here that I have, so we've seen in the international organizations in the last, let's say 5 years, a growing interest in what we call local political and social agency. That is the ability of individuals to act politically. Well, what they act for, what is it that they try to do? However, although international actors, the UN, the donors, and so on and so forth, are increasingly talking about what ordinary people on the ground want, how they act and what they mobilize for, they're also quite concerned about what it means for them. So these quotations, the first one is from somebody from UN Political Affairs, high up in the UN Secretariat building in New York, whose opinion of this turn to local agency, to trying to engage more directly with political actors in society, in conflict-affected societies, was that international personnel, senior political actors on the international stage, whether political elites or administrators or bureaucrats and so on, should not expose themselves to this local context, because they risk, as he says here, they risk their ignorance undermining their legitimacy. That's a really interesting statement, which comes from very high up in the UN system. It's not that the UN is against engaging directly with society. It's just that people in the UN know they don't know very much about society, about conflict-affected societies, because there are so many barriers: great distance, socioeconomic barriers, cultural, linguistic barriers to engagement. And what's really important about the UN for this particular individual is its legitimacy. And its legitimacy is built on being able to offer democracy and human rights and security to people in conflict-affected societies. It's not about being able to speak their language or engage with the day-to-day politics of those societies. Another kind of position on this turn to the local is this, you can see in the second quotation here, relating to Haiti in particular, where somebody from the UN Peacebuilding Commission told me that what Haiti really needs is trusteeship. The Haitians can't be left to govern themselves. Government is too corrupt, and people are too disorganized on the ground. So it needs external governance, benign external governance run by the UN, and so on and so forth. So what you see in those first two quotes is a common international reaction to dealing with local politics. That it's too complex, it's too far away, it's too messy, it's difficult to understand. And in fact, it will produce a type of state which won't be peaceful. Because they quite often say to me, well, the conflict came from social antagonisms, political antagonisms in Haiti, so why would we let the Haitians govern themselves? So the justification for trusteeship. So what's happening here is the internationals, just to sum it all up, are saying, well, we have this great system for peace building and state building, but it's not really working very well. So what we need to do to make it work better is to get closer to local societies. But when they get closer to local societies, they realize that actually they don't know very much about them, and that realization undermines their legitimacy. It undermines how they understand their position in the world and in context. So they respond to that turn to the local by saying, well, actually what we really need is external governance. We need trusteeship. Another view on this turn to the local is that actually the problem isn't in local politics quite often, but it's in the divided international system itself and the lack of political will. This is the view I got from UNDP, which is often one of the more enlightened international agencies when it comes to understanding the need for much closer relations between local social agency, political agency, and intervention, the nature of the state, and so on. But yet another view, which counters that attempt to close the gap between local societies and the international nature of the state, is that quite often when you bring up this question of local agency, political activism, mobilization, attempts to own the state, is, well, actually, look, the local is the Taliban, or it's Hezbollah, or it's LTTE. In other words, the local tends to be driven by militant, terrorist, or other types of political organisation which cannot be allowed under the constitutional framework of the liberal state. So although the internationals would like to engage more closely with local politics and local aspirations and local claims, and of course that is what is important under democracy, you have to do that. When they try to do it, they realise that there are all kinds of obstacles to their attempt to do so. Can we go to the next one? So the question here is, well, what kind of state And indeed, what kind of international architecture would arise if local social political movements were allowed to determine their own state and to contribute to their own regional and international order? In other words, what would happen if we built the international order from the grassroots upwards, rather than the way it's been done in the last 25 years, which has been from the top down, the top being London, Washington, New York, Brussels, effectively. That's the axis of power and norms which has been building this system, at least until the last 5 years, where now we have competing systems. Again, we have a more multipolar world. What would happen if we actually had a democratic order being built from conflict-affected societies through the region and so on and so forth? Now, of course, we can say all kinds of things about that, but of course it's not my position to say it, because I'm not a local, I'm an international, effectively. And I come from an epistemological setting where, that is the West, the global North, where we are used to speaking on behalf of others. And we assume that we should. That's the whole point of that system of intervention. And we're used to the assumption that that's legitimate and justifiable. Now, what I'd like to do is invert that and say, what happens if the expert, which I'm not, I'm just interested, but the expert which we assume, the expertise which we assume, is returned to the local, and is returned to the range of actors, from the activists, the grassroots actors, the NGOs, the social movements, the religious actors, to the political elites, through the institutions and the constitutional setting of the modern states, in the region, in the modern world. What type of peace would emerge? I can just say a few general things about that, because of course I can't define it, being an external. What we can say is identity is very important, different types of identity, not just ethnic or religious, by the way, but also cultural identities. One of the things that I heard in the UN last week when I was there was an acknowledgement that economic, social and cultural rights need to be returned to the political agenda. So what they're saying is, in the last 25 years, we've been trying to build a state based on technology, politics, institutions and law, and we haven't been talking much about the economic, social and cultural rights of the societies where those states are being built. And we have to recognise that those economic, social and cultural perspectives are quite different in different contexts. It's different talking about economic rights in Liberia, right at the bottom of the Human Development Index, one of the poorest countries in the world, or Timor-Leste or Afghanistan, in the bottom 4 of human development. Quite different when you talk about that in a different situation, let's say a mid-level development setting. Cultural rights are quite important too. They motivate people, they mobilise people on the ground. People at the international level aren't interested in culture. They're only interested in some kind of, prettified version of culture where you can go and sit down and have a nice meal and look at some national dancing and that kind of thing. But they're not interested in the political force of culture. That is, its historical attributes and what it means for modern society. Another issue which is really important then is inequality in its material and its identity forms. Now, we have been interested in, for example, minority rights in the last 25 years, but we haven't been interested in the deeper questions of structural inequality. That is, the relationship of one state with another in a global political and economic hierarchy. In fact, the liberal peace architecture of the last 25 years has assumed that the hierarchy, represented by the Human Development Index, with some of the Scandinavian states and the US and Canada and Britain and most European states right at the top, is going to remain indefinitely. And that is just the nature of international order. Every other state will stay there. And it's not the role of international organisation or international architecture to adjust that global political economic hierarchy, to level it out, to flatten it off. So the last 25 years we've rejected that as necessary for dealing with conflict in war-affected and development settings. Now, there is some return of that issue back onto the agenda, particularly because there's been a realization that development issues are structural. The global economy is a structural issue. Globalization is not all positive. Inequality has hit the big time with the publication of Thomas Piketty's book a couple of years ago, and it's back on the international agenda. So what I'm saying here is, if you go right down to the local and you read the construction of the modern state and the international order from the view of a citizen, one citizen, that person will raise a whole range of issues which are actually quite different and maybe more sophisticated than the sorts of issues that an external policymaker or indeed an external academic might be able to raise. Because our positionality gives us very narrow vision about what's important politically in another society. Can we just go to the next slide? Okay, so we've been going on for quite a long time. I guess my time must be almost up.
Okay. Well,
but I don't want to, so I want to just finish off with some more positive arguments. If we change the unit of analysis of peace, the state, and the international order to this local level, to what we call the subaltern in social science, anthropology, sociology, that is, the individual who has experienced what it's like to live in the everyday setting of a conflict-affected or development situation, then we can start to reconstruct the state and the international. And we can also start to reconstruct what it means to have an international system which is capable of a broad range of interventions, from military intervention, as you saw with NATO intervention, through to developmental or donor assistance. And that may also start to reconstruct the legitimacy of the overall system, the interventionary practices, and the state that is being built. So I would call this peace formation. And I would say that we could start to think now, looking at the last 25 years of experience of peace building and state building, of what that would mean for the institutions of the state, for the legal framework, human rights law, for humanitarian intervention, for thinking about security in a broader scale, from state security or regional security to human security. What it means to position that subaltern peace formation actor in the modern state, in the international, in his or her social context, political context, justice context. So that involves a need to reconstruct how we understand this modern state. The alternative to making that move, the alternative to trying to do that, is very negative. And in fact, I can point to a growing number of countries around the world where there is no intervention, and probably there can be no intervention, where the state has failed, where human rights are not present, where an awful lot of social political mobilization is occurring, but there is no capacity to make peace from the external level. You might want to look at the whole of the North African Mediterranean region, all the way from Morocco, Tunisia, all the way around to Egypt, the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, Syria, and further on. That whole region now is unstable, destabilized. There are a lot of social movements on the ground which are doing all kinds of great work, peace-wise and development-wise, but the state in those situations is in a complete deadlock. Existing power structures in those countries are immobile. They are unwilling to respond to the demands of the people on the ground, and they're locked into a regional order which is very, very fragile, not to say dangerous. So the form of state that's arisen in those situations, we have no access to at all. And there's all of this peace formation going on in those situations, which seems not to be able to influence the regional order or the state in question. And the UN in New York, the World Bank, the European Union, has almost no access to these countries either. So there's no real direct external capacity which one would have used in the last 25 years to stabilize, to intervene, to bring human rights, to do development, all those sorts of things. It's just not there. It's not able to gain access. So something has gone very wrong with peace building and state building when you look at the latest wave of conflicts. So this is not, talking about Bosnia and Kosovo and Cambodia and Guatemala and all that 1990s stuff. When you get to Iraq and Afghanistan, you start to see problems emerging because they become increasingly militarized and interventions and less focused on local social agency and human rights and so on. And now, in the range of conflicts which have emerged in the last 5 years, there's no intervention. There's no capacity to provide all of these public goods, international public goods, that one would have expected. Just a couple of examples, though, of what is going on, and that's rather positive, in some of those other conflicts, not in those situations that have emerged in the last 5 years, but in the 1990s. In Timor-Leste, and this building that you can see here in this picture, is an example of a kind of hybrid state which is emerging. This is where local social political agency has engaged with the international model of state, the liberal peace model, and has started to build something which connects local identity, customary practices, and the questions, those broader questions of inequality, which relate to Timor's place in the modern world, with the modern state formation. And what it really means is that local people have occupied the modern state that's been built in Timor-Leste. And their vision for Timor-Leste is not really Denmark or Sweden or Norway or Britain, it's Singapore. It's a hybrid confluence of identities, very, very developed, hyper-capitalist state, but not one which is necessarily putting human rights and democracy first. Well, that's their right. That's their right of self-determination. They fought for that over 20 or 30 years, and if their vision is to make themselves like Singapore, fine. But this picture here indicates how local historical practice, social identity, has become part of the Timorese state. When the internationals arrived in Timor, they wanted to create Norway. They didn't know anything about these little houses. These are called houses of resistance in Timor-Leste. These are symbolic of how the political resistance movements over the last 30 years maintained themselves, coordinated themselves, and acted to try and build Timor into an independent state. When the internationals arrived, these houses no longer existed because the occupying forces had burnt them all down because they'd seen them as sites of resistance. One of the things that the Timorese have done over the last 15 years is use the political space that the state-building operation has provided them with to rebuild this local political and cultural identity. And it's reached the parliament. It's shaping now the modern state after a decade and a half. Next two, please. So in Cyprus, something slightly different has happened. In Cyprus, there's been a 50-year peace process. There's never been a high-level agreement, but the two communities in Cyprus who were formerly at war with each other have adopted all of the human rights and democratic conventions that one would expect to turn themselves into modern European democratic states. But they've never been able to reconcile. So there's been no reconciliation across the ethnic lines in Cyprus, except amongst some very small social movements that have formed. And it seems in Cyprus that the lesson we can draw is that the high-level political leaders across both sides of the divided society are locked into a language and a framework which cannot ever be resolved. They make claims for two separate sovereign territorial states. And in that language framework, in that political framework, there cannot be a resolution because the two states are mutually opposed. They claim the same land, but they're two separate states, just as in Israel-Palestine. This picture here is of what's called the Home for Cooperation in Cyprus. And this is a kind of civic forum funded by the...
I've been here last year.
Yeah. So it's a small building. It's actually in the Green Line, which is the demilitarized zone between the two opposing armies, which is patrolled by the UN forces. And this is one of the few spaces in the island where the communities can meet, where they have all kinds of different activities, social, political, academic, and so on and so forth. And in that space, all of the enmity, all of the opposition between the two communities, the two peoples, is resolved. They've worked out how to deal with all of the root causes of the conflict. Political leaders go there, and in that space, political leaders have also resolved their issues. It's only when they travel outside of the Home for Cooperation, into the rest of Cyprus, that their investment in the long-standing Cyprus conflict means they cannot be reconciled. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that this is a very small space. It's a little kind of building in the Green Line, in the demilitarized zone. It doesn't show any real possibility of expanding into the broader country itself. So it's isolated. What you might say is that the people in Cyprus who've resolved the conflict have created their own little mini-state, and it's just one building, effectively, because they reject the conflict and the two states that are perpetuating that conflict. If we could just go to next one. Yeah. Okay, just to finish up then, the next one. Now, these patterns, the Timor-Leste example shows how local social movements are able to take over the state slowly and influence its development. The Cyprus case shows how peace movements can exist, but they do it in confined spaces. We see this repeated time and time again in all of those different conflict-affected societies around the world. Somalia and Somaliland, you might think, are unlikely places to be talking about peace. But in both of those cases, it's been organisation on the ground which has tried to mitigate violence, mitigate power relations, and provide public services and law. And to do that, they've drawn on local resources, minimalistic resources, but local resources. Customary law, local political institutions, religious institutions, and the material resources that ordinary people have access to, very limited material resources. They've created a kind of shadow state in both locations where people get education and healthcare in limited ways at the social level, but the state is dysfunctional. Cambodia. Now, what we see in Cambodia emerging under liberal peace building, more direct liberal peace building, is a vibrant human rights movement and a lot of civil society activists. But the formal state is still locked into a kind of oligarchic, elitist conflict mode. Similarly, in Sierra Leone, in Kenya, we have all kinds of different social institutions emerging, which are putting a great deal of pressure on the state and on the internationals to improve their practices and to transform themselves. Now, the question then that remains for us is, what can we do to make sure that the state and international practices of peace building and state building are more closely related to what these local social movements and actors are actually already achieving on the ground? How can we reduce the gap between these peace formation local actors and the state frameworks, whether legal, political, economic, or social, and international intervention? And I think we have to remember that in the last 2 millennia of international relations, a world system has depended on intervention to survive. And intervention depends on legitimation by the societies who experience intervention. And it seems that in the last 5 or 10 years, certainly since the Iraq and Afghanistan adventures, that connection between the practices of intervention, the legitimacy of the system itself, the state, and what social and political organisations in conflict-affected societies, the gap has grown. So now we have to start thinking about how we can narrow that gap again. And my suggestion is that we narrow the gap by transforming the state and the international according to the wishes of the local, which is the reverse of what's been tried over the last 25 years, where we've tried to make the local follow the wishes of the international through the state. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much.